it was seen as a really high-risk project for us. The amount of people who said, no, you can't.
Conservative peer Kulveer Ranger.
Kulveer Ranger.
Former advisor to Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London.
Hugo.
The co-founder and CEO of Minima.
The only layer one to run a full node on any device.
Devices will become more and more intelligent. They'll be able to learn from their surroundings and make decisions. And that is when blockchain technology really comes to the fore.
Oyster, it was such a huge success. It broke down the silos of public transport. The cost of implementing the platform that is Oyster onto the cycle hire scheme was just disproportionate.
As you get billions and billions of devices all doing a small amount of work, then you have a huge amount of hashing power that's created in a decentralized way.
Transport basically became transport technology.
If you have something like blockchain, where actually you can have a sort of horizontal solution for all sorts of verticals, whether that is for underground, whether that is for car parking, whether that's for cycle rides, and actually each device at the edge is able to verify its transaction and keep a record of it, that is where it's going to come.
Hello and welcome to the We Are Deep In podcast. I'm your host for today's episode. I'm Charlie Apthorpe, the CEO and founder of Athena Communications. And we're here for a very, very special episode with two fantastic guests to talk about the convergence of digital transportation infrastructure and digital trust. Introducing our guests, we have Hugo, the CEO and founder of Minima, and Lord Kulveer Ranger of Northwood. Lord Kulveer Ranger is a member of the British House of Lords, formerly Director of Transport Policy for City Hall and the Mayor of London here in the UK. He currently is co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for digital markets and digital money and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for artificial intelligence. In addition to that, he is known for being a member of the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee and as one of the core team members who oversaw the rollout of the Oyster Card's payment system for transport for London. So thank you very, very much for being here. Hugo, why don't you kick things off?
Excellent. Well, thank you, Charlie. Great to be here with both of you. So I'm Hugo Filer, co-founder and CEO at Minima. Minima has been building since 2019. We're a layer one blockchain that is completely decentralized in that every single device both constructs and validates the network. So we have no centralized infrastructure. Everything is run at the edge to deliver sort of full blockchain functionality.
Brilliant. And Kulveer, you've previously had a lot of experience working at really the forefront of emerging transportation infrastructure, but now you're sitting here on the We Are Deep In podcast. Talk us through this transition from your previous experience in government to now this interest in emerging AI and blockchain technology.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, and it's great to be here with you and Hugo. It's quite a journey. I feel quite old now because I've been at this a while. And over the last, almost 27, 28 years, I've seen a great change. Most people have, if you're my generation, in terms of not just technology, but how we actually use it. And that's played a big part in both how businesses have evolved. And I don't mean the big businesses that we all know of. I mean the infrastructure providers, the organizations that, as I call it, do all the sort of plumbing within houses, provide the backbone, the infrastructure, the networks, the cyber, the supercomputing, the capabilities that platforms run on, and the managed services. So I spent my career kind of one leg in looking at transport infrastructure and delivery of, and then sort of moved into technology and the application of, because transport basically became transport technology. And that's been the interesting journey that I've seen, if I can use that, because transport's all about journeys. But the really fun thing about it is you get to see the future, and then you get to see the future arrive, and then you get to see the future be adopted. And then people go, well, that was all quite obvious anyway. And you're like, but I watched that all happen over not a matter of days or weeks or months, but really years, because it does take years for things to ferment, to develop, to evolve, to iron out the creases, to then be used, and then adoption, and then failure, and then proper adoption, especially when we're talking in the remit of not just public services, but services that the average citizen will use, whether it's public or private. So an exciting couple of decades, but I really feel there's a lot more to come. And I think Hugo and what Minima are doing is going to be a big part of that.
It's funny actually. I came from the Paddington Station today on an electric bike, and I worked in London for 15 years, and then have been out of London for 10 years, and I was marvelling at the fact how much it's come on from then. Because when we first had sort of Boris bikes and stuff like that, you had to get onto this bike that wasn't electric. It was really hard, and you get really sweaty wherever you went. Whereas now you get on an electric bike, it whizzes along, and all of these amazing sort of bike ways and stuff like that are now in place. And so actually it's a very, very sort of nice and happy experience. And so just like you were saying, I mean, the initial idea was pretty clunky and was hard to adopt, whereas now it just feels like everyone's doing it. And so cycling along, I just thought, okay, actually you can see how these things transform, but as you say, these things take a long time, and they take a lot of building in the background for a long time before actually the general public just sort of take it for granted.
Well, it's interesting, Hugo, because we talk about iterations, or in software development, versions, right? And we all go through versions. And now the average person's used to it because their phone will get a new version, dare I say, Apple saying, you must update to OS, whatever we're on at the moment. And if you remember way back when, we would talk about patches. We'd release a software patch on an operating system to fix stuff that was going on. And that was really enterprise-based software, so things that were going on. But now it's just part of everyone's lives. People, look, I drive a Tesla, and, if the great Elon decides a new patch arrives on my car, an upgrade, and it changes some of the digital buttons, which really is quite annoying because I'm not ready for that change. So the world has changed, but where you start from is the hardest part, I think. It's gaining momentum. And you mentioned, Hugo, thank you for the Boris Bikes. They were a project I led on at City Hall, amongst many things, but it was seen as a really high-risk project for us. Boris Johnson was mayor, but the political capital he was expanding on, saying we're going to make this city a cyclized city. And the amount of people who said, no, you can't, for many reasons. We had dangerous roads, we had thefts, we had small narrow roadways, we had not a culture of cycling, or HEVs, articulated buses at that point that were called the bendies, that made it very hard on our road network. All these challenges had to be overcome and be delivered and changed, and you had to deliver something of quality and expectation that on first contact, although it felt hard and clunky, we did design them to be hard and clunky, we just didn't want people to fall off them. They had to work. And actually at that point, it was a case of, we launched with 5,000 bicycles. And even back then in 2010, there were 500,000 journeys by bikes a day in London. So I knew there was only going to be a small element of the population who really get access to these bikes, and also only in very central London at that point. But you're trying to deliver a new iconic mode of public transport that every Londoner should feel they have a vested part in, even if they don't ever get right. So what do you think is the most important thing? It's safe, it works, but what it looks like. And I know you've had a career in marketing. It had to be something that people could immediately say that when it landed on the streets, those docking stations and that bike, it looked and felt like a new icon for London. Something like as iconic as the Black Taxi or the Routemaster bus. And I was absolutely conscious of the fact that we must meet all that criteria: safety, work, new icon. And then when you move into technology, it's not just about the technology, stupid. It's not that, well, let's make it really interesting around the tech. It's got to work effectively. But the bit that most people will engage with will be the look, feel, the experience, the CX, the customer experience, the user experience. And I think too often people fail to spend at least a third of their time on that very crucial, important point that's going to help the whole overall success of whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm assuming as well that as much, again, it's sort of the sort of advancement of technology from a sort of physical perspective as well. So I'm sure that the uptake of bikes changed dramatically when they became electrified, because obviously it's a much easier experience, and so you're not going to get like having to like sort of lug these heavy things around, and I think often these are the case. You get one technology and it requires another technology to sort of be included with it for things to really take off, basically.
Well, you say that actually, and it's a really good point, because one thing that we couldn't bring together here with the cycle hire scheme was the Oyster Card. Now, I'd worked on the Oyster Card, part of the team that delivered that in 2003. We could talk a bit about that later, the game changer that was from an e-money perspective. But the card, you'd have thought, and the big success of it was the integration and the seamlessness of it being used in every part of the public transport system, except the bikes. And it was sort of a no-brainer, right? Of course you're going to get this card to work on the bikes. And we couldn't get the card onto the bikes. Now, the reason was it was cost prohibitive. The cost of implementing the platform that is Oyster onto the cycle hire scheme was just disproportionate. And it was in the tens of millions, and the scheme was not of that kind of expense because the card's design and its capability is for a high volume, highly secure system with thousands, hundreds of thousands of transactions happening, and the rigor and the integrity of that system demanded a level of capability that we had to pay for, the service we had to pay for. We did not require that level of service on the cycle hire scheme. So it wouldn't make a business case. It didn't make sense to invest tens of millions implementing a system that was kind of 80% redundant in terms of capacity. And that's why we didn't do it. We got a lot of criticism for not implementing the Oyster Card. And I personally felt very hurt by it. Look, I'd worked on the Oyster Card. I was delivering a cycle hire scheme. Surely I could get these two things to come together. But it wasn't meant to be. But that demonstrates sometimes that there are other things that have to be taken into account where you can't get the perfect answer that you're looking for.
Yeah. I mean, I think actually, interesting. I know this wasn't sort of a setup to the answer, but actually, if you have something like blockchain where actually you can have a sort of horizontal solution for all sorts of verticals, whether that is for underground, whether that is for car parking, whether that's for cycle rides, and actually each device at the edge is able to verify its transaction and keep a record of it and stuff like that, that is where it's going to come. And those things are all hidden under the hood in every way, and they will become, that's what keeps me going day to day, because I can see that is, as devices become more connected, they're going to need to have that sort of payment layer that is completely immutable and completely trustworthy between devices, so that it can be interoperable, because adoption is only ever about convenience, really. I mean, you get the few that are sort of early adopters and will sort of put up with a slight sort of walled gardenness of a new experience. But most people only want convenience. Unless it makes it more convenient, then they're just not interested.
It's got to be frictionless. Right? That's what we're getting to, and because it's otherwise, what is it for the user, the citizen? Why am I facing this change? Why am I having to learn this if it's not giving me something? It's going to make it easier, which is why, we come back to Oyster. It was such a huge success. Thank God it worked, and we spent a lot of time making it work. But as soon as people started to use it in anger, well, it was seamless. I always say it broke down the silos of public transport, because before Oyster, you were either a bus person, a tube person, an overground rail person, or a tram person, and never your mode of transport shall meet. You knew those things and you bought a bus ticket and what Oyster did was it just opened those different modes up to people. They could explore easily. They weren't concerned about what happens if I haven't got the ticket to go from A to B to C. The car took the strain of that. And that enabled the sort of what we entered into a true era of multimodal journeys, where you could go tube, bus, tube, train, and just seamlessly do it. And it worked. And I think that where you start talking about what's happening in networks, you start talking about nodes and what's happening at different points and how you connect it together. When you overlaid a new network like the cycle hire network onto it, we couldn't integrate. Now, if we'd had a blockchain solution and we were using that instead, we could have used that platform. We're talking 2010 at this point. But also, to jump into another part of what we're going to talk about around electric vehicles, not the vehicles, let's talk about the charging networks, because that's another network you're layering upon. And I was very keen for it to start to be considered as part of a transport network when you start putting charging networks in. Now, we're talking quite far back in 2008, and on behalf of the Mayor, I set up the London Electric Vehicle Partnership. There were two reasons for that. One was manufacturers were starting to develop electric vehicles and test them, and we wanted them to come to London rather than take them into other parts of the world. So we wanted to show some initiative that we were doing and keen to get electric vehicles into the city. But there were two actually progressive boroughs, Camden and Westminster, who actually had charging networks, even at that point. But they were setting up different charging networks. So the standards would be different. Now, these two boroughs are quite next to each other, and I had the joy of sitting with these two boroughs going, so excuse me, you're going to have a different network, and you're going to have a different network. And what happens when people cross boroughs? Well, that wasn't their problem, but it was the problem, because a network is only consistent when it works across. And then how does that integrate with other things? So the charging for electric vehicles became the focal point to drive a market conversation, but it also was a point about getting standardization.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, interestingly, charging again, it's a big area that we're looking at. In terms of, so many cars are now coming online, but actually, there's still a lot of anxiety for people to actually adopt it, because they look at the availability of charging stations in sort of wider areas, not just sort of metropolitan areas, and then they also look at the fact that actually, charging really still, if you go to a public charging station, it still costs about the same amount as if you've got a petrol or diesel engine, which sort of really is off-putting when you've got to weigh up the cost versus the time you have to spend charging and everything like that. I mean, obviously, batteries are improving, so time is going down, but there's still a lot of range anxiety for people. Yeah. And what we found is with some of the partners that we're working with is that, they're looking, so these are OEMs, so producing cars like Volvos and Zeekrs of this world, and they're looking at ways to actually expand out the public infrastructure to actually private infrastructure to add into the public infrastructure, so actually allow users who've got cars to actually rent out their wall boxes for charging, because that can reduce the cost and also expand out the network. But in order to do that, you have to have a sort of a secure payment system that allows you to do that, basically. So that's sort of the area that we're looking at.
I think it's absolutely right, and that even now, how many years ago it is now, I was looking at, actually, are we really going to be owning this car? And even then we were looking at that model. The reason was because actually EVs, a similar product type towards that is mobile phones, in terms of a battery, a piece of kit, that what's more important, the battery or the kit? And actually sort of the early stages of the mobile phone era, and you guys may be a bit too young for this, but I used to carry around 2 batteries or a spare battery pack, because the range anxiety on my phone was the concern. I don't think any of us really we care about battery life, and considering how much we do on our phones. So I think cars and batteries is a conversation we'll have for now, but I think it will move on. I think the battery conversation will evolve. Range anxiety is still there. I see how EVs have become a social economic phenomenon. They work at certain levels for certain levels of society on a sort of monetary level. Can they afford to buy the car? Do they have access to a charging point, at home in their driveway and wherever they? But there's going to be sort of, I believe, a sort of morphing. We had a chance to deliver. We deliver the cycle hire scheme, and the French in Paris had done a very good scheme called Velib for their bikes, but they'd gone to another level with Autolib, which is where they tried to do the same with cars. Leave cars dotted around the city and allow people sort of autonomous access to them with, access and so on and so forth. I had to talk quite carefully about that scheme and talk the mayor to not do that scheme in London, because I didn't think putting more cars onto London's roads in that manner was what the city was ready for at that point, because the technology wasn't quite there, the availability, the understanding of how it was going to work, even the cost model of it didn't quite work, especially when car hire is such a prolific industry in its own right. Why would we be wanting, as a public sector, trying to do that? But I think what we're going to see is, as we see a convergence between electric vehicles, potentially models like Uber and vehicles that are on demand, and even autonomous vehicles. I think that's when we're going to see another step change in both public and private personal mobility, because the car will become the service. And I actually say that my other car, we're a one-car family for a very average, middle-class household with 2 kids, and we have one car because I don't believe in having two, one of which was just going to sit on the driveway as a lump of metal, and I might drive it once at the weekend. So I say my car is an Uber, because if I need a vehicle, that's what I use. But I think that's the model that's really going to become interesting going forward. How does the vehicle become something that is used in a communal way, in a way that does different things? How do we access it? What kind of networks do we use? What's the security availability? How does that? And that's, where something like a blockchain approach can really help. But fundamentally, because much like a phone is no longer a phone, a car is no longer going to be a car.
Yeah, it's just subscription, really. I think this, going back to your point about the batteries, the interesting thing about batteries is that, it's going to be 60% of the value of a car is going to be in the battery. It's like, the rest of it is really just the casing around the battery, getting you from A to B. But also the way that batteries have been treated through their life cycle is going to be the important thing. So, if you want to buy a car these days, you sort of kick the tires and you check the brakes and all that kind of stuff. Whereas actually what you're going to be doing is wanting to know how the battery has been treated over its life cycle, because, trickle charge versus supercharge, that has a dramatic effect on the health of the battery and the state of the battery. And so getting battery passports, again, which is a big area that we're looking at in terms of battery passports, and being able to have an immutable record of how that battery has been treated over its life cycle is going to be crucial as well, basically.
And I think that transitions quite nicely on why it's so exciting to have you both here, and this is going to be such an interesting conversation. So, Lord Ranger, there's been this transition in consumer preferences and how the consumers want to travel, and you can draw parallels between, I think, what's going on now with electric vehicles and these new innovations in autonomous driving that we've been discussing, and what was happening back in the early 2000s with the rollout of the London cycle hire scheme and the Oyster Card scheme. But how's the regulatory context actually affecting companies that are looking to actually roll out infrastructure, large scale infrastructure in these sectors?
It's a really good question, Charlie, because I think there are many opportunities here, but whether it's regulation or whether it's an approach to regulation around both data usage, access, privacy, a lot of what Hugo was saying about, say, cars and their data. Well, whose data is that? Considering especially if the ownership model is not quite one of, well, I own this car. Because even now I find I own this car, but someone else sends software changes to it and all kinds of things happen to this car that are a bit out of my control already. So we've got to understand whose data that is. And actually going right back again, and I hate to harp on about Oyster, but even then, when we implemented the Oyster Card, it was the first time that we were going to be generating journey data. We hadn't had anything like that before. The question was, whose data is it? Is it the individual who's doing the journey? Is it the network? Is it the operator? And is it the people running the software systems in the background? All different stakeholders in the delivery of the solution. And I think at that very early stage, we decided, you know what? It's too hard a question to answer. We're going to bury this. No one can look at this data. It's private, actually. A decade later in City Hall, I had everyone knocking on my door saying, that data that you're collecting, Transport for London are collecting, it's really valuable. We can do something with it. We can model with it. Even TfL can utilize it. People wanted to gamify. People wanted access for other things that they could do. You could develop twins. So we had to work out a way of how do you provide access to that data, although it's anonymized and so on. So that was the evolution in around 2010, 2011, which actually then I set up the digital office for London. We were doing things then like the London Data Store to give not just the public bodies the access to that information, but actually private sector organizations. So that's a bit of just potted history around what's happened. And I think we learn from that as we go forward, and we should, as more now legislators, about the potential models that come through, the application of use cases like electric vehicles that will be autonomous and how they're going to be used, or even privately owned, semi-privately owned, hybrid model, rented model, whatever the model is. That data, how's it going to be owned? Who's going to own it? How are you going to have access to it? What's the value? What part is anonymized? What isn't? And these are sort of the complex debates actually that are going on right now in Parliament, in and around a whole set of different types of bills. And I don't think one bill actually puts, the finger on this topic. There are going to be a number of different bills, both at the moment and in the future, I think.
I was doing a bit of reading, and I think the two big ones from my kind of research on this ESPR in Europe, which includes the digital battery and digital product passports that I think are coming in next year in 2026, and we have DPDI in the UK as well. But I think whether or not we're going to have digital product passports in the UK is still being sort of emergent, and I think that then sits alongside, as I'm sure you're well aware, the environmental efforts we're going, which I believe will require every vehicle in the UK that's manufactured or sold after 2035 to be 100% renewable and 100% electric. But perhaps if I bring you in here, Hugo, that's a big challenge, not just far off, but in the next 6 to 12 months in terms of these battery passport regulations. How can blockchains, and specifically tools like Minima and the suites of products that can be run on your blockchain, how can they actually help these large enterprise clients address those regulations and start to comply with them?
So, I mean, I think, well, I'll answer that question and then actually go back to the idea of who owns the data. I think, from a battery passport perspective, everyone, so you now need to, a battery has a life cycle. First of all, it's constructed, it's put together with lots of different components, and you have to see where those come from. And you have to, the rare earth metals that are used in those as well have to have provenance and everything like that. So you have to be able to take it right from there. And then you have the life cycle of actually usage, where you work out how it's been charged and how it's been handled. And then obviously you have the afterlife as well. So actually they then, these organizations that bring these batteries to life then have the responsibility to then deal with them in a environmentally responsible way. So and blockchain can actually be part of that process, can actually be the sort of the tamper-proof ledger of all of those different parts coming together, the life cycle of the battery itself, and then, as I say, how it's then dealt with afterwards. So that is and by running a full node on those devices, you can actually get that sort of immutable ledger, basically. So that's how it can be done using blockchain. And I think there aren't any other any other, because what you want to do is you want to have the ability to record that data on the device itself. It doesn't need to have any centralized entity recording that data. It'll actually you go to the device itself, and then you can actually check that. So that's the kind of conversations that we're having with big enterprises to actually look at how to introduce passport data, battery passport data into the system. But also the other area where blockchain is very important is, again, who owns the data. So, and again, I think you made a very good point over there about the ownership model will dictate in many ways, because if you own the car, then you should own your data. But if you've got a subscription, then it's probably a joint ownership between the supplier and the subscriber, basically. And again, blockchain is very good at being able to store the data, but also store it securely. So again, as a user, you can probably, in the future, you'll be able to decide which data you want to make public or give to insurers to reduce your premium, or give to other potential buyers of your data, knowing the trips you make and the type of trips you make and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that as we've seen with the internet became very centralized around the big players like Google and Facebook, and then obviously everyone realized that it was free because they were the product and their data was being used by that basically. And I think that people are now becoming more aware of it. But even then, I mean, people only want convenience. And so unless you make it convenient for them to actually sell their data, I mean, they'll want to, because again, it's potential revenue for them. But until you make it convenient, then it's going to be a challenge, basically.
I think you're right, Hugo, but it gets even more extreme in a commercial model, because it gets to the point, people want convenience, but they also want best price. So, you kind of sell your family data for £2 off your next latte out. I don't mean that, but people give you these offers. So you could have a question of, you're about to take I keep using the example of Uber. Other ride-sharing apps are available, or ride apps are available, but you could have the option of, well, I'll take this journey and I'll let the device, the platform, have all my data, and they can bombard adverts to me in the car, right? Or I don't want adverts and I'm willing to pay a couple more pounds not to have the adverts. Or, and then you're going to start playing these commercial trade-offs, which are already happening. Or in fact, at the moment, as we see, and I do feel quite sad about this, that we're all quite quickly able to just jump off do I want cookies? Am I willing to have them downloaded because I want to get to the article, the access to the platform, whatever it is I'm trying to get to. And there's this friction level of giving away something which has a lot of information behind it, but I'm never quite sure what I'm doing, but I actually want to get to do that, so I will do it. But I feel slightly guilty about doing that, because what am I giving away? And if I'm going to spend another hour reading what I'm giving away, you see where we're going. And I think we will have to look at that model to say, I don't think that's quite right, the balance on the user, the citizen, the consumer, on how they're being, I don't know if I want to say precious old, but kind of being enticed or encouraged to just go past it very quickly, because we are giving away a lot of information and that has real value. So there's that bit, but there's a bit about the edge, which, edge computing. And I think we were talking about edge computing in industry quite significantly about 10 years ago. Its time didn't feel like it came, because the challenge was, how do you move so much data centrally and back and forth from various nodes or points where things are happening, and the kind of bandwidth, and if we're talking about energy usage and everything else. So does it make more sense to have something at the edge, the computing power, on a vehicle, or whatever it may be? But it never quite came to fruition. But I think if you layer upon an element of security and capability like blockchain that is so simple yet effective at providing that ledger, that ability to be secure, I think it might come again. I think edge computing comes back onto the table in a more exciting way, and in a more not just affordable but easier to apply way. So I think that's maybe something that's coming.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's the convergence of lots of things have to come together to make it convenient. So, you have the devices that are now more capable and powerful,
Much more.
much more. You have the, and now you obviously have AI entering the world as well. So devices will become more and more intelligent. They'll be able to learn from their surroundings and make decisions. And then that is when blockchain technology really comes to the fore as well, because those devices need to make decisions. They need to act on them, and they need to have a payment rails and an immutable trail of what's happened to be able to do that. And so I think it requires. So again, there's lots of good examples of technology sitting in the sidelines for a long time, like QR codes. I mean, QR codes, I was trying to sell QR codes into advertisers in the early 2000s, and everyone's like, well, I'm not quite sure. But until you had the smartphone, then it didn't make sense with cameras and all that kind of stuff. And then it didn't really make 100% sense until you had COVID, the COVID period, when actually everything started being done without touch. And suddenly you had a technology that was invented in 1994 that suddenly became the thing that everyone used in 2020. So 25 years later, and now suddenly QR codes, everyone uses them. And I think that, which is a last point, I think it's a similar thing where edge computing was the right idea, but actually didn't have the capabilities in terms of the powerfulness of devices at the edge, and then also the sort of the secure infrastructure to be able to make those devices act on their own, basically. I mean, as we've seen, we're becoming more and more prone to cyber attacks, and as more and more things become connected, then that's where cyber attacks can happen.
Hugo's hit the nail on the head there. Because, edge computing was seen as ta-da moment. Oh, we don't have to have all these, centralized information. But suddenly we opened up a whole new level of vulnerability. And that vulnerability just was like, hold on, we can't manage that vulnerability. So if we can get a level of security around that network at the edge, and all, then you move forward on it. And as you say, it's a combination of things that come together.
Yeah. And it will require challenges to happen, like the cyber attacks, in order to go, actually, we do need now to make the effort to actually step change the underlying technology of how this happens. Because obviously, what we find a lot, we talk to a lot of enterprise clients, and there's a lot of sunk cost in the current technology. And so at the sort of the senior level of management is like, well, no, we can't afford to sort of rip everything out and start again. But actually, when it becomes business critical, then you go, actually, we need to have a more robust solution. And that is the point that takes time, but people start to realize that it is worth investing in the next phase of innovation to actually allow these things to happen.
So carrying on that point, Hugo, as you were saying, this enormous threat, and from a regulatory standpoint, enormous kind of concern with how secure these systems are from be it a bad actor, a hostile state. But what really makes Minima kind of unique as a network in terms of providing that kind of security? Because you were talking about centralized points of failure, but we've talked about Minima as perhaps one of the most, if not the most, decentralized blockchain, and having quantum computing levels of security potentially, depending on how technology evolves. But talk us through that on quite a granular level.
Yeah, so I guess the history of Minima is one that started actually with my co-founder, who's the tech genius side of it. He was mining Bitcoin back in 2012, so he was very early in sort of the world of blockchain and loved the idea of a decentralized network that is secured by sort of a multitude of computers. But the challenge with Bitcoin is that it's a competitive solution. So effectively, computers have to compete against each other to find and secure find the next block and get paid and secure the network, basically. And so that was always the idea that's always going to lead to a centralization. I mean, you look now, and it's three mining pools that control the majority of the hashing on the Bitcoin network, which is the security. And so what he wanted to do was look at a way to actually enable all devices to actually be an equal on the network, to actually construct and validate the network by themselves, basically. So what we now have is a blockchain that is secured by the devices, but they're not competing against each other, whereas they are collaborating with each other. So they all do a small amount of processing work, which is the proof of work, and it gets added together to secure the network. And what that now means is that as you get hundreds of thousands, millions and billions of devices all doing a small amount of work, then you have a huge amount of hashing power that's created in a decentralized way. And it means that every single device can secure the network and can interact with other nodes and devices on the network. But if that one goes down, it doesn't take the rest of the network down.
And we've had issues with, I think, I don't want to name names, but particularly, I believe Solana famously has gone down a number of times. I think people are always kind of surprised when they hear about a blockchain going down, because it seems to be the very essence of decentralization is there isn't a centralized point of failure that could be go wrong or be actually actively targeted. Yeah. But on that point of specifically centralized validator nodes, and perhaps do take an example of of Solana, but play nice. Why is it that they can go down and you can't specifically?
I mean, they do have centralized validator,
and you don't,
whereas we don't. So
at all.
No. So at the end of we launched in 23, and at the end of 2023, we turned off all of our centralized servers. So the entire network is run by devices at the edge. So we literally have no centralized infrastructure whatsoever. So now every single device adds to the network and is completely decentralized. And so that is something that we believe is going to be the future of where blockchain technology will go. It's always talked about as being a decentralized system, but actually the majority of blockchains at layer 1 level have elements of centralization, and you can't remove that because there's the sort of the commercial incentive for these centralized elements, where they're miners or stakers, to actually continue to consolidate, because the more they consolidate, the more money they make and everything like that, basically. Whereas if you take out that commercial incentive, and so the only reason why the node runs is for the utility that it provides. So the utility, i.e. a secure network where it can actually transact device to device in a secure way, then that is where we believe mass adoption is going to come. So big organizations and small organizations will be able to run a node on a device, whether it is a phone, a car, a light bulb, or a sensor, and get that horizontal network of secure transactions without any centralized entities being in control. Because effectively, we talk about, the initial excitement around blockchain and Bitcoin and everything like that was like, we don't need centralized banks. But actually, what we've now done is we've effectively replaced centralized banks with centralized miners or stakers, basically, which are all commercially incentivized. Whereas what we now have with Minima is a completely decentralized network that is secured by the devices. So the more devices you have, the more secure it becomes and the more useful it becomes.
I mean, it reminds me of something, Lord Ranger, your former boss, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, where he said, my view on cake is I'm in favour of having it and eating it. Yeah. But, so you get the impression there for these large enterprise clients, like Siemens and Arm, just name a few amongst your partnerships, they are getting that level of scalability and essentially efficiency within that network without having that risk you get with those traditionally centralized systems, while retaining the level of control and oversight that they'd be looking for from a commercial perspective.
Can I add, isn't the dynamic, and we're talking abstract, for some of our listeners might not quite understand all of the concepts, but what does edge mean? We think big chunky pieces of kit that is effectively operating on a bus or in a car or something. But aren't you, and I believe you have the sort of capability now where you're actually saying, well, our blockchain, our model can fit onto a microchip, and it's integrated into supply chains. Yeah. So the use cases suddenly goes boom, doesn't it? It's like the ability of what is an edge, what is a network, suddenly dramatically changes the scale of X times a million. You could do anything. Yeah. And I think that's where there's both excitement and a potential terror of, oh my God, what genie are we about to unleash? But I think we've got to help people understand what the potential use case is going to be here, because we're entering into, and I've always spoken about a digital society. If everything around us, and people are fearful of losing control, that's one thing, but also losing control through cyber attacks. And obviously, well-known retailer in the UK has been affected by a massive cyber attack recently. They're dealing with that. But if they had a different cyber posture, if it was based on a blockchain solution, if it had an integrated throughout their network, throughout their system supply chain, would that give them an added level of security? How,
absolutely.
Where would they be?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, as you say, to your point, we started Minima's journey by running on mobile phones. So effectively, the mobile phone was the node, and it was doing the work to secure the network. The next phase is we're on IoT devices and on the head units of vehicles. And the next, albeit slightly longer term plan, is to actually have Minima on chip. So effectively, you have a full blockchain node running on chip. We're part of the ARM flexible access program, which gives us access to their IP, and we're working with them and their partners to actually design this and roll this out. And this means that effectively on silicon, you'll actually be able to have the functionality of a blockchain, which means that any device, whether it is large or small, let's say a sensor versus a car or anything like that, can actually have that blockchain capability. And that's highly secure because it's effectively, it's an immutable ledger of a record of the transactions that take place. And it, again, it'll be like Intel Inside. No one really knows what it is, but actually everyone will be running a blockchain node in the background if you need your device to make a purchase. So, so an AI powered fridge will decide that actually you're running out of this ingredient or that ingredient and actually want to make a purchase. So actually, rather than set up a bank account and go through the rigmarole as it'll actually literally be able to make a decision and make a payment, and then you will have your fridge replenished all as you sleep, basically.
The old fridge replenish use case that has been around for quite a long time, but we haven't been able to line up, as you said earlier, converge all the different elements of the technology that will actually both make it happen, but also keep that a level of security and safety and understanding for the user that what's going on and feel confident to do it.
Yeah.
And will you have a little jingle? Like the
Well, I mean,
Minima inside?
maybe. I mean, it's a bit like, it's like they were going to say, electric cars were at one point going to have. I know a guy who created the jingle for cars, and he was going to be a multi-millionaire as a result, but actually they decided not to do it. But so there might be a jingle. But
I do have a current question for you, Kulveer, but just a short anecdote. Sometimes some of the Minima team, a lot of us have watched Silicon Valley, the kind of TV show. I don't know if any of the watchers are familiar with it, but there is a scene in one of the episodes where their sort of enterprise storage system's about to go down, but one of them had been kind of messing around trying to hack a fridge, and then the storage had just gone in a decentralized manner across the entire fridge network. So it's one of those things of kind of science fiction sometimes actually potentially coming to match reality.
Yeah, I mean, we have a team at the moment who are working on an AI agent that will actually sit on the node. So the agent will actually be able to literally completely autonomously make its own decisions and receive and make payments for the services it delivers. I think that is that's where we're going to get to. And I mean, that can sound quite scary, but also it can sound very convenient as well. Yeah. And I think that is where you get that. But again, it requires a coming together of a number of different scenarios, both in hardware and in software, and technical advancement.
Hugo, you remind me, I used to say this for decades about how we created our own personal digital ecosystems. I tried to coin this term, it never really took off. But the concept was, it really sounds to start dated with all the stuff we're talking about. Each one of us has created our personal digital ecosystem. We've bought our infrastructure, which laptops, phones, etc. We have our connectivity. We pay for our broadband, our Wi-Fi, whatever it may be, 5G. And then we secure our platforms. We all have memberships to, whatever social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, X, whatever it may be. Those three elements create an ecosystem around each one of us that allows anyone to sell to us what they want to sell, bombard us with it, although we have access to do things. But we create that ourselves. By now, we're into, the security of that. Where does AI fit into it? You mentioned IoT, the Internet of Things, a really good, exciting theory for the last decade, if not more. But now, these things that are coming through enable it to happen. Throw in edge. So that very simple ecosystem that I'd been talking about for about 15 years, I've got to add all these other elements that are actually going to make it a lot more around the sort of digital world where we can effectively do things without having to do anything. We don't have to have the hard infrastructure, voice control, agentic AI, the connectivity that just seamlessly moves through rather than, what's that password here? Because I'm in a secure, potentially blockchain enabled connectivity network. I don't need to do that. And am I concerned about the amount of compute I've got? No, I'm at an edge network, which it's all fine. The future is there and it's almost arriving.
Yeah. I mean, I think, given the fact that we are deep in podcast, in many ways, deep in projects, digital infrastructure, decentralized infrastructure networks, basically, is all about giving autonomy and control to the user to actually become part of that network and add value to that network and be rewarded for it as well. And incentives are a huge part of getting people to do stuff and why people be part of that network. And so I think that and that's a very interesting area that I think is coming through. So you have the enterprise looking to decentralize because of resilience and security reasons, and then you have the ability for actual individuals and users to become part of adding to an infrastructure, whether it's EV charging, whether it is data storage or compute or telecommunications, stuff like that. That is all coming together.
And we're on that journey to that future ecosystem I just tried to describe. But I did notice a little jump towards it a couple of years ago when our main car was a Tesla, and I had to connect the car to my charger, which was a separate charger, to my electricity provider, my Octopus. And I suddenly realized I was having to connect these 3 different networks together, and I was standing there with my fingers crossed. Please allow this to work, because the only way I was going to get the solution that I wanted, which was much cheaper electricity for my car via my charging point. And I have to say, for 6 months, it didn't work. There was something not quite working between the connectivity and the reading between the devices, that even though I'd clicked the right things, connected the right things via my phone and everything else. And yeah, my phone is another integrated element of that network, but it did then work. Yeah. And that was, it sort of dawned on me, that's something that in industry I'd been talking about, the sort of, digital house of the future. We used to have these conversations. Here I was, doing it. Now, still a bit clunky, not quite as frictionless as I'd really want it to be, but we're there, and we're going to keep going. And hopefully that's where we ease out the challenges for the users and the citizens as we go forward.
And if I can ask you a sort of a follow-up question on that, you're on quite a few different sort of parliamentary committees and parliamentary groups. And the way I kind of perceive this is, people with certain types of roles and certain types of interests are very, very focused on solving that problem for them, right? Insurers, want to make sure the data is immutable. People interested in artificial intelligence want to make sure that AI agents can carry out value transactions. People who are very focused on the environment and green initiatives want to make sure that people can actually use electric vehicles and can easily rent them off each other and carry out electric vehicle payments. People interested in product security want digital passports of products and digital batteries to validate their authenticity and so on. There's all of these use cases, but when you sit in these various different committees, there is an understanding, I think, now on a technical level that blockchain is not necessarily catch all, but pretty good in terms of tying all these things together into a unified system. Is that coming through in the different sort of committees, or is there still work to be done there in terms of creating that awareness?
I think the challenge with something like blockchain is that it was a technology or a platform way ahead of its time. It arrived, and I think Hugo, as you said early on, it went into a world of Bitcoin and crypto quite quickly, and kind of stayed there. And so a lot of people's kind of latent understanding of it comes from that environment. And what we've probably spent most of this conversation talking about is actually how, as a secure ledger, it is applicable to so many different areas. And I think there's a piece of work to be done for people to understand the application in real world environments that we've been talking about, because that's the key. And in the in the meetings and the committees and the chambers I sit in, Hugo, Charlie, that you refer to, and there's lots of them. I don't want to be talking as a technologist. I want to be talking as someone who we're looking to design for people. So it has to come from a people perspective. We always talk about, in industry, again, user-centric design. There's lots of terminology that's bandied around about this stuff, but it genuinely has to come, because you have the techies, really great brains, like Hugo's brother, who is like, out there doing all the tech. But then you also have to have Hugo, who can convert that into something that's probably more of a, what does it mean for that person, and how they use it, and how does it make their life more simple? And when it does that, what are the risks that potentially emerge? And as policymakers and parliamentarians working with industry, how do we understand the level of risk? Do we need to mitigate? Do we need to manage? Do we need potentially regulation? Or can we evolve it in some other way? I think that's the challenge in the environments that I'm in.
I think, and I think that, crypto has had good and bad moments in terms of its sort of publicity and stuff like that. Obviously there was a huge amount of excitement sort of in sort of early 2010s all the way through to sort of 2017, 18, 19, all of that kind of stuff. And there was a lot of excitement about the potential of it. And then also, the challenge with blockchain is that it does take away the centralized entities of banks, which means that it puts people in charge. But obviously, that then opens up people to be sort of socially engineered and hacked. And so, if you press the wrong button, then in the traditional sense, you might have the bank ringing you up and saying, "Look, this looks a bit dodgy." Whereas if you press the wrong button with crypto, your money is gone and it ain't coming back, basically. And that is a hugely scary thing and a big step change for people to really understand how to secure themselves. So, again, giving people freedom means that they have to take responsibility, and I think that is a big step change that will come about, but it does take time to do that. And so there are lots of horror stories within crypto of all the bad things that have happened to people, and people have lost money and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that does seep through, we found, to wider adoption by sort of big organizations in the in the sort of Web 2 world, because all they read is the sort of horror stories and the headlines, and so there's a lot of education that has to happen, working through the actual benefits and functionality that a blockchain can actually give to them and their users in terms of resilience and convenience, but also cost as well. Because I mean, if you imagine, at the moment you have centralized systems that are hugely costly to maintain and everything like that. Whereas if you put all of that functionality to the edge on the device itself, then actually you're pushing that cost out to the devices and potentially to the consumers who are being part of that cost infrastructure. And so that actually becomes a hugely appealing solution for large enterprises, because actually their costs can actually be distributed as a result. So there's lots of positives, not just resilience and convenience, but also financially as well. And so there are lots of incentives all moving towards it, but it does require education and also technology and hardware to evolve as well. And all those things come together at the right time, then that's where it's going to have a huge change.
Hugo's point about education, as you were highlighting some of the committees I'm on. So I'm vice chair of the AI APPG and co-chair of the Digital Markets, Digital Money APPG. Now, for me, again, as someone who spent my career in technology, I see these as frontier technologies that actually we need to understand the use cases of better as parliamentarians. Whether we understand the level of detail around the technology, I'm not the technologist. I'm not that person. I remember when I set up the digital office for London, I had every tech company wanting to have a chat with me, which was great. And they'd all come in with their box, their technology. Hi, Kulveer, we have this technology, it's brilliant. It's XYZ, blah, blah, blah. Wow, straight over my head. And I go, great. I've got these policy challenges. Can you help me with them? And they go, yes, we can. We have this box. So you've got to be able to bring the technology towards the challenge and bring it together and help people understand how one helps the other. But we can only do that by having more understanding of the educational side. And that's why these sort of all-party parliamentary groups are so critical, I think, and will be going forward for a next generation of both MPs and for current peers and new peers like myself, because I don't think there's that many of us actually who come from the tech sector who are sitting in Parliament at the moment. There's a few very learned people who understand technology, but not that many who've actually been in the industry and delivered and been involved in what it takes, not just to develop innovation, but to be commercial, to understand a use case, to understand why people will adopt, if they'll adopt a solution. And I think sometimes policies are made without, a solution to deliver it. Sometimes technology is made without what is the actual solution it's trying to solve. We're at a really exciting time where a lot of, as we've both said, technologies that were developed over the platforms, concepts over the last 15, 20 years are maturing. AI is playing a large part in that because it's acting as a kind of facilitator for a lot of these things around it, and will then enable us to do a lot more, which we will need to understand better.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've covered a lot here, so we might start to tail off. Perhaps, Hugo, I'll leave you any final closing words, perhaps to the Minima community, if anything exciting happening over
Well, I mean, as I say, I mean, we've been on this journey for quite a while now, 6 years, we've been building, and we've always been building it with the future in mind, not just can we make a sort of, can we do something really quickly as a shiny young tool, because we do believe that actually to have a truly decentralized network and a truly resilient one, you have to be able to be on any device and not have a sort of centralizing element of competition, because if you can get into every device at chip level, so effectively be on any device that comes out of the factory, have that little sort of functionality, so to be able to horizontally communicate with any device to to make a payment, even to create a token at the edge for payment, whatever it is, that is where it's going to end up. It's been a long journey, and our community have been very supportive of us, because they've taken the long view, and we believe that the long view in the future, everyone's going to look back and go, well, that was obviously the solution. But it takes a long time to get to that point. So I mean, as you were saying, Kulveer, it's the overnight success will come, but there's a lot of hard work to get there, basically.
I guess you're going to say there's going to be a regulatory standard that affects potentially billions of devices that has to be achieved for a standardized manufacturing. And in your view, that's your partnership with ARM, and that's the direction.
Yeah, exactly. If you can get onto every device, then you basically become the the internet layer for value transfer, and for that, whether that is actual payments or whether that's a data, because data is going to be, as it talked about, the new oil. Basically, the data is there. So if those devices can own their own data and control their own data, that is going to be very powerful. And so all of that is coming together, and that's what we've been building for, basically.
Brilliant. Hugo, Lord Ranger, thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, you.
Thanks very much.